I suppose it grew out of a general interest in history and a curiosity. I'd been involved in map making in the regular army, and I'd been involved in detecting things as an investigator in customs and excise. And there's nothing so interesting as a mystery, is there? And I got involved in the Society of Lay Hunters by accident. Paul Devereux, who used to edit The Lay Hunter and has produced many excellent books, stood down, and Danny Sullivan took over the editing of The Lay Hunter. And then that went out of business, and soon afterwards the Third Stone magazine went out of business. And I thought it was important that the Society of Lay Hunters should continue to exist. And there was a chap down in Sussex who kept it going, but then had to go and work overseas. And I really thought, well, I'll keep it in existence for the sake of the idea, because I think the idea is more important than the individuals who may be in a society at any one time. I was only chairman for a year or so, but it just saw it round that particular hurdle. And long may it go on as a place for people with that particular interest. Who I think the present chairman's a chap I know who lives in Poole, which is handy because I live up the road from Poole. But the Society of Lay Hunters is deliberately a broad church. We don't want to say to somebody, we know what lays are and you don't. That typical arrogance that you get associated with certain religious beliefs. We want to say everyone's got a point of view and they're all entitled to express it, and we can learn from everybody, because it's rather like having a giant jigsaw puzzle and we haven't got all the pieces in place yet, so we can learn from each other. I carried out a survey some years ago for the Society, and we sent a questionnaire in some detail to every member throughout the world. And we do have the odd member in Australia and Japan at the time. And you find then you get a perspective of all the different opinions. I've still got this information with me in the car today. And it's most interesting to see what people who are interested in the idea of straight line alignments think they're about. And there's a tremendously diverse range of opinion. And it isn't for any one person to say that everybody else is wrong.
And modern archaeology are now...
Yes, it is interesting that archaeologists that used to have to run a mile at the idea of alignments because they had careers to pursue and their professors wouldn't let them have degrees, or the people interviewing them for jobs wouldn't let them have posts, and posts in archaeology are like hen's teeth, they're very scarce. It's beginning to change, because you are now getting professors like Dr. Gale at Bournemouth carrying out research on Cranbourne Chase into Bronze Age barrows, actually saying at a public meeting he's found barrows which are aligned on each other. Doesn't say that they're aligned on anything in the sky or anything on the horizon, but they are aligned on each other, which is interesting because that's admitting the concept of alignments. And then we also have Professor Wainwright, who chairs the Wessex Archaeological Company, on which I represent Dorset, who lives 7 miles from Preseli, and is aware that there are clearly things to be researched, and is finding out a great deal about the quarry at Preseli, from which the stones were taken about 134 miles to Stonehenge. And of course you do have that giant triangle that Robin Heath has written about that goes from Stonehenge through Glastonbury to Lundy, the island of the Elbow in Iselin, the elbow being the right angle, that goes up through Caldy Island to Preseli, a 13, 12, 5 Pythagorean triangle over that distance. And if the hypotenuse is extended, eventually it gets to Giza, which is like Stonehenge, a coded form of information about the diameter of the Earth. So there is things going on which is now beginning to become acceptable, at least to talk about if you're a professional archaeologist, whereas 40 years ago it would have been death to your career.
Michael, you explained very well the station stones and the accurate rectangle at Stonehenge, and how important that sighting of Stonehenge was in terms of knowing about the planet, maybe knowing about Earth axis shift, maybe knowing that that was a very good place to start doing observations.
The only place you could do it, you have to be at that latitude to have the rectangle, because if you go to a lower or higher latitude, the rectangle is then pushed out of shape. So it has to be where it is to have the alignment on the moon standstill positions at winter and summer, as well as the sun positions for sunset and rise for winter and summer as well.
Because the earliest archaeological evidence at Stonehenge talks of dates of 7,500, 8,000 BC.
8,000 BC in the car park of the ministry parking arrangements for Stonehenge, found by accident very recently. And what they found was they said, well, hang on, there's a tree here, or there must have been once because of the hole. They then say, hang on, we've got 3 posts about 1.5 meters across. And would you believe they're in a straight line alignment on each other? We don't know what these posts were. Were they, like the Reading in British Columbia, very tall carved totem poles? We don't know, because all we've got is the rotted wood in the hole, or where the wood was in the hole. But are they also showing that the people in 8000 BC, which is the pre-farming time when we were still connected to the continent, but we were hunter-gatherers, Mesolithic people, are they looking at the sky? And is this something that they were, at that early date, using this area to align? Because this is pre-Avebury. We normally regard Avebury as the Mark I ancient site. But here are these 3 posts in the car park at Stonehenge, which are pre-Avebury, because they're wood from about 7,500 to 8,000 BC.
There is a document linked to Noah and the Ark arriving on Ararat, where the party who left the Ark set off for the outer extremities of the west.
Oh, the Hyperboreans, the people who live beyond the north wind.
To set up this surveying means and if we did find that our great catastrophe was the Earth axis shift, and the Earth had shifted on its axis, then maybe they wanted quite quickly to try and find out what had gone wrong from the point of view of measurement and where they now were.
If the Earth had shifted on its axis, there'd have been catastrophe for so many people. If you lived anywhere near the coast, the tidal waves would have wiped you and your farm and your very existence out, gone. If you lived on a mountain top, you might have found that it all fell down around you. I mean, it would have been a terrifying time. Which is interesting, because Caesar, when he was saying to the Celts, who were jolly brave and didn't mind dying because they were going to be reborn, they believed in the transmigration of souls, the one thing that did frighten them was the sky falling. And of course, if you did get the Earth axis changing, the catastrophe for people who were living at the time on the surface of the Earth would have been like the sky falling, because it would have seemed as though the stars were moving to the horizon rapidly. So it could be that.
Well, Bernard Dallaire wrote this marvellous book with a colleague. His name was Davis, who's now died, unfortunately. But Bernard Dallaire wrote a book called When the Earth Nearly Died. And he's very interesting. He gave a very good paper at Fitzwilliam College at the Society of Interdisciplinary Studies earlier in October. And the point that's being made is just how much the Earth would have crumpled and shook and moved with massive faults and massive movements of the Earth crust on such an issue of the Earth being hit very hard by multiple impacts.
There's no doubt it happened. When it happened, we can argue about. I mean, you have got the lakes in Canada, which look as though they were hit at an angle by things arriving from the northwest. You have the enormous hole at the Gulf of Campeche, which is now completely covered up and therefore took place 50 million or hundreds of millions of years ago, long before human beings existed as human beings. But things must have happened a lot more recently as that, and I think perhaps the Ice Age came to an end as a result of some global warming brought about by either the Earth's angle to the sun changing or something arriving that changed the climate very significantly and caused the sea levels to rise by about 300 feet in a few thousand years, which is why you get all the stories of the flood in every culture around the world.
So if the ice had been moved into a temperate zone,
that would have affected the climate, wouldn't it?
Shift, then you would have got this very rapid melting of the ice.
But it would have been like a fridge for a while, wouldn't it?
Explained it. And when you have the mammoths grazing
with all the food in their tummy,
with the steppe grasses in their tummy and their mouths, suddenly frozen.
Yes, instant freezing.
because the earth has tipped
Yes,
into
the fridge has
then
arrived.
into a cold
You haven't
zone.
opened the fridge door, the fridge has overwhelmed you.
And then all the vast quantities of water washing around, and caves which seem to face certain areas.
Or the Banwell Cave in Somerset.
Full of debris.
Yes. All have been chock-a-block filled with bones as a result of some sort of water action in a hurry. And I suppose you can get the dates of the bones and work out these animals were alive. And what are the animals? Well, we know there were things like rhinoceroses and hyenas and things which don't live here anymore. So it must have been a different climate when that happened.
That's right, we had the woolly rhinoceros. It must have been cold.
Yes, and the mammoth, which is the
And
woolly
of course
elephant.
the mammoth,
Yeah.
which is a magnificent animal, enormous size.
Yes. And that mammoth, well, you know, was wandering around the North Sea as recently as 30,000 years ago, because you can bring up the teeth in your nets as a fisherman. The Dogger Bank was land then, and you'll say, hang on, tell me the age of this, and they can do a carbon dating on it.
That's right, and the major part of the ivory trade for a very long while were the mammoth tusks which were being excavated in the Soviet Union.
Well, where I live in Dorset at Christchurch, the top of St Catherine's Hill, which has had gravel pits dug into it in the past, things which came out of the gravel 6 foot down included elephants' tusks and the saber-toothed tiger tooths and things like this, and they're in the Red House Museum to this day, I believe. And they're, of course, pre-Ice Age, because they're warm animals that look as though their bodies at least were washed along by the tremendous movement of the gravel when it was deposited. Perhaps the Ice Age before the last one deposited that lot.
Yes, we've gone through a procession of hot periods and cold periods.
And the cold periods are much longer than the hot periods.
Yes.
We're in the end probably of an interglacial at the moment, a warm period, because warm periods tend not to last as long as the one that we're in now. So when we wring our hands about, oh, global warming, perhaps what we're moving towards is global cooling, because if the ice melts at Greenland, Labrador Current won't work, and then that means that the Gulf Stream won't work, and then we'll be as cold as Newfoundland here.
Well, our solar specialists seem to be telling us, with great difficulty with the strength of the climate change bandwagon, they're telling us that the sun is at its most active level now, more active than it's been for the figure I couldn't believe was 400 million years. And
the sun has been warmer in the past than perhaps it is now, because if you look at, for example, what was happening at the time that the Vikings went across to North America and reported that you could grow crops and have animals out of doors in Greenland around about 900 or so, or you have the people who set out fleets from China about 1400 and went round the oceans of the world. You actually got Chinese DNA in the people in Norway because they were able to get around Siberia into the North Sea from China. And because of a political decision by the then emperors, it was all written off. And yet 90 years later, in the same century, Columbus goes to North America from Europe.
that's right, and your friends in Dorset who came to mine the flints and to set up the farmers on the Marlborough Plateau and the Dorset Downs, they had to experience 2 degrees warmer than we are now and double the rainfall. And it looks as though this 400 million year figure for peak activity on the sun doesn't make much sense.
Well, we know people were using the Avon to get up to Salisbury Plain. Christchurch Harbour is the natural harbour of Wiltshire. And photographs taken by English Heritage stored at Swindon now show that there are ever so many barrows not previously recognised up both sides of the Avon on the hills either side. Just as you have at St Catherine's Hill at Christchurch, about 15 overlooking both the Stour and the Avon. They're all the way up because the barrows are the claim to land for the family farm in sight of Grandpa's grave up on the hillside. And when you get up to Salisbury Plain, of course, then you're in an area of tremendous ranches, because the Wessex culture was probably based upon massive agriculture using cattle rather than necessarily ploughing up the land.
I think they had their enclosures rather like in Africa today, where you find fenced areas away from the
Yes, keep the animals off the fenced area.
The crops, and it was certainly pastoral as much as anything else, and we know that from the people's teas.
Which later on gives rise to the need for hill forts, because cattle rustlers were resisted by having hill forts that you could drive the animals into, but you wouldn't need to keep them there very long because it would be a seasonal activity, a bit of raiding.
It looks as though the hill forts, though, began to be built around about 500 BC, which is parallel with the Romans breaking away from the Etruscans, and the Romans involving themselves in the privatisation of land, which was contrary to all the beliefs about the communal ownership.
Probably the hill forts began in the late Bronze Age. Hengistbury Head, which is a promontory fort with double dykes, designed to resist attack by chariots, the tanks of the day, using slingshot, which women and old men can use from inside the higher bank with a palisade in front of it. There's an even earlier ditch further back towards Warren Hill, V-shaped ditch and therefore military in purpose, which looks as though it could have been an initial Bronze Age protection for the harbour at Barn Bight, which Professor Cunliffe has excavated, and then they needed to move the defence further away as the site developed, doing trade with the Carthaginian people, the people from Cadiz, Philistines in the Bible, what do we call them, Phoenicians, who would perhaps come up once a year and take some slaves away in exchange for some bronze equipment once they'd picked up some tin to make bronze at Devon and Cornwall, or maybe they would take away some lead and silver, which we know was bought by Packhorse to Hengistbury from the Mendips. The Romans knew it too, which is why they were up at Charterhouse and the Mendips within 3 years of arriving in Kent. The emperor wanted the silver.
And that lead was something like, in some places in Cumbria, 17% of the material was lead. So 17% of your lead could be smelted into silver.
Yeah, well, I think at the Mendips it was 1.5% to 2% they thought was silver. And they would resmelt it at Hengistbury over a bone half, which would help the silver come out. They could then make coins of copper, dip it in silver and seek to pass it as silver coins. The coins, incidentally, were bad copies of the stater of Philip II of Macedon, who was father of Alexander the Great. So we have an idea as to when it was happening, perhaps around 200, 250 BC.
Can I come back to an earlier point you made, just to close this conversation from the interesting point about climate change, which is on everybody's mind at the moment. If our solar specialists are right, and we have got a peak of sunspot activity or solar activity, a peak in 2012, and nothing more than that in 2012, 2012 will indicate a change in the climate. And we know that from all the records, the ice core records, etc., tree rings, that our change in climate from hot to cold is normally very sudden, yes. Sometimes in as little as 10 years. It
can happen in 3 years.
3 years. So
if you get the snow on the ground for 3 years running, you can recreate permafrost. So it can happen very quickly. If the Labrador current stops, the Gulf Stream stops, snow on the ground for 3 summers in succession, you're back in an ice age. Then you've got a problem, because the political consequences of that for food supply and for transportation and for habitation, well, there's an awful lot of us human beings. Perhaps now there's too many, and Gaia may be deciding that it's time to cull us a bit.
Michael, that was very interesting, particularly your point about climate change and the idea, whole concept that, of course, that people were travelling to Greenland and farming in Greenland. And you made a number of other very important points about the fact that it must have been much warmer during maybe 1300, before the Little Ice Age. And we also talked about the people who lived in Dorset and came to find the high quality flints on the high ground in South Dorset, which are of great value and importance to the whole of Europe.
Well, the Isle of Wight was a good place for flints,
yes.
In particular.
They arrived clearly at a time, which was about 3000 BC, when it was 2 degrees warmer then and twice as much rainfall. So that was why it was imperative that people lived, worked and farmed on the high ground.
Yeah, things would grow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And animals would reproduce and have things to eat themselves. Mm. So, yes, we've gone through hot and cold spells before, and we probably will again. And you go back as far as who's the chap who wrote Christmas Carol? Charles Dickens. And he has stories about people roasting oxen on the ice in the Thames. And that's not so far ago in time. What is it? 200 years, if that.
That's right. It was fairs on the ice.
Yes.
Winters were, well, I can remember a winter in the 60s, was it, where we had snow on the ground from before Christmas until
Well, I'm
March.
even older than you. I can
You can remember the cold ones.
cold one of 47-8, I think it was. Another cold one in 63. I mean, there are icebergs in Lymington River that meant that the ferries couldn't go to Yarmouth because they couldn't get their ramps down. I know, because I was stuck on the Isle of Wight for 3 weeks. I was the only customs and excise officer on the island at that particular time, and the others were all stuck on the mainland. So we're used to having cold snaps and warm snaps, and why do we make such a fuss about it? It's part and parcel of living in the world we live in. And the big threat at the moment, I think, is the risk of another ice age, not of us getting hotter and hotter, but us melting enough ice to get colder and colder.
Well, I think that the figure that I was talking about this morning in my talk, about 1/25 millionth of a second, the sun gives out more energy than mankind's put out in 100,000 years, is an interesting one, because the obvious conclusion is that the sun is such a major driving force with the solar wind right the way across our universe as a source of principal climate change, and then creating a magnetic field which protects us from cosmic rays. And cosmic rays are beneficial in the right quantities before they
not too many.
Not too many, but they create those low-level clouds over the ocean that allow the Earth to be cool.
I think the whole global warming thing is a mixture of people getting on a political bandwagon and people who have a genuine interest in ecology and keeping the world clean and decent place to live in, but have let themselves be persuaded or frightened in a way which is irrational, because as you said, the sun is by far the greatest driver of our climate, and whatever we do is a spit in the eye compared to what the sun does.
That's right. Richard North has written a book called Scared to Death, where they've dealt with all the issues in which so-called scientists have frightened everybody to death over the last 6 or 7 years. Christopher Booker has co-written it with him. And I find that it seems unbelievable that we have so much scientific dogma. We've always had religious dogma.
It's to do with journalism. Bad news sells newspapers. World will end tomorrow and you can sell your newspaper. Going to be a sunny day tomorrow, we're all going to sit on the beach and have a nice time. You won't sell any newspapers with news like that, will you? There's no story in good news.
That's right, but people who have these high ideals like Al Gore, who've really been, in my opinion, he's a politician and may well be on the electoral trail, and that may be why he's involved, if we're really cynical about the situation. But if we're looking at the impact of Al Gore's The Inconvenient Truth, what we've found is a massive amounts of subsidy and state funds all over the world being pumped into research or climate change issues. One of which, of course, is biofuels.
Yes.
And we had
oil companies want to replace the oil before it all runs out. That's
right, but we've got a situation where vast sums of money from the state are encouraging people to grow all manner of crops as biofuels. And one of the big problems, of course, is that the specialists tell us that the only crop where we can produce fuel economically are the sugar-based crops. And this is where genetic modification will come in, and those crops being grown in the tropical regions.
This is far more worrying, I think, than global warming. I think genetically modified crops is a frightening thing, because nobody knows in the long run what the consequences are, and nobody has had sufficient nous to make sure that you keep them separate from everything else. Not that you can, because you can't stop the wind blowing the pollen from one field to another, or a bee flying with it from one field to another. And I think that the genetic modification of food may be by far the greatest threat to human survival than the fact that we've got a warm spell going at the moment.